Hey guys, so today I want to give you a quick peek into our investment portfolio by focusing specifically on the best index funds and ETFs for financial independence. I'm going to be sharing with you today 4 equity funds. These are funds that we currently invest in right now and some others that we've invested in the past and we think are amazing funds to invest in for financial independence. What you invest your money into for financial independence really does matter because it dictates how much you generate in returns by investing your money, how long it takes for you to actually achieve your goals, and finally, how much peace of mind you have from investing your money every single month. From the 4 funds that I mentioned today, you only really need a couple of them to create a simple global portfolio. These funds I'm sharing today are not the only funds, of course, that you can explore to invest in for financial independence, but these have the right characteristics in that they employ a passive investing strategy, they are super cheap to invest in, and they've been known to deliver a cracking return over the last few years. In addition to these funds I'm mentioning, it's definitely worth mentioning that you should consider having some allocation to bonds and to cash for a level of protection, depending on what your attitude to risk is, as well as where you are currently on your wealth accumulation journey. So please take what you can from today's video as education and use it to create an investment portfolio that really works for you, one that fits your own personal circumstances, as well as designed to help you achieve your specific financial goals as well. If you're really enjoying today's video, I'd really appreciate it if you hit the like button, because that just helps to get this video shared with many other people. I'd also appreciate it if you support us on this channel by hitting that subscribe button as well. It's worth mentioning that all the funds I'm mentioning today are not in any way, shape or form financial advice to you. It's not a recommendation. This is purely me sharing from an educational perspective, so do please make sure you carry out your own personal research. Now, before we go into these specific index funds and ETFs, it's very important to understand what an index fund and an ETF is, okay? Luckily, we've made a very detailed video previously on this very topic, comparing ETFs and index funds. I'm going to put a link below to that and the bar for you to head over and watch that video if you are currently not confident when it comes to the subject of what ETFs are and what index funds are and why they differ. Okay, so the first fund to mention is the Vanguard FTSE Developed World ex-UK Equity Index Fund Accumulation. Wow, that sounds like such a mouthful, but it's an incredible fund, and this is a fund that we currently invest in within our ISA at these very moments because it's a globally focused fund that tracks the FTSE Developed World ex-UK index. Ex-UK means that it excludes the UK as a market. Now, this particular index is comprised of large and mid-sized companies in developed markets specifically. Now, this fund is ideal if you are somebody who has a lot of exposure already to the UK market, but want to gain global exposure in other areas without more exposure from the stock market to the UK. So, for example, you might have a lot of exposure in property, for example. This particular fund might be suitable for you if you're somebody who wants to remove that local bias and gain further exposure to other markets around the world. It's super cheap at just 0.14% per annum as the total expense ratio, and it delivers an impressive annual return so far. Of course, past performance doesn't inform future performance, but it's just quite interesting looking back at what the performance of this particular fund has been, which I'll share with you guys in a moment. Here on the screen right now is a summary of the key elements for you to watch out for in this particular fund. If you're looking to invest in this fund, these are the key things to watch out for. So you can see there we've got the fund name, and of course we've got the fund type, which is the index fund. The fund size is important. They're £9.2 billion. My experience is that any fund over £1 billion or $1 billion is usually a good size to aim for, okay? You can see that the price for this particular fund at this very moment is £481.44 per share. So it's quite an expensive fund to buy into from a per share perspective. The index being tracked here is the FTSE Developed World ex-UK index, and note there are 2,081 stocks within this one fund alone, okay? In terms of minimums to invest, it's super low. It's either a £500 lump sum or £100 per month on a direct debit basis. In terms of performance, you can see there on the screen, 2020, 14.15%, 2019, 22.82%, and in 2018, there was a slight dip of minus 2.96%. But cumulatively, since this particular fund was created back in 2009, it has done, since inception, cumulative returns of 385.72%, which I think is pretty amazing when you think about it. But there are other funds, which we'll talk about later on in this video, which have done way better than this particular fund has done for the same time period as well. Performance-wise for this fund, you can see here on the screen that £10,000 invested in this fund back in 2009 would be sitting at £47,632 today in 2021. That's 4.7 times your money in the 12 years that this particular fund has been in existence. 70.3% of this fund is allocated to North America, with 67.5% of that being to the USA. Note that this fund has allocations to other areas such as Europe, the Pacific, Middle East, and a very tiny allocation to other countries as well. But the allocation to Europe of 15.3% has a zero allocation to the UK, which is very important to note. When you dig a bit deeper, you can see that from a sector perspective, there's quite a large allocation to technology, so 22.8% allocated to that, with 15.9% to consumer discretionary, and so on. And when you dig even deeper to the key holdings within this particular fund, you can see the likes of Apple, Amazon, Facebook, Tesla, Alphabet, which is Google, and so on. Okay, so the second fund to mention is the FTSE All World UCITS ETF with the ticker code VWRL. Now, this is a super popular fund and one that I invest in at the moment within my pension. And I do this because it's a global fund that tracks the FTSE All World Index, which covers about 90% of the investable universe right now. Now, this particular index fund is comprised of large and mid-sized companies, but note, it's comprised of companies in both the developed markets and the emerging markets. Okay, so note this company has large and medium-sized companies, but excludes smaller companies. So this fund, when you compare it to that first fund that I mentioned, includes exposure to countries in the emerging markets such as China, Brazil, India, South Africa, Mexico, even Russia, and so on. It also has an allocation to the UK of 4.1%, given its all-world remit. This fund's actually one that you could put money into and just forget. And we're just going to put up on the screen a summary of the key facts for this particular fund for you to check out. So on there, we've got obviously the name, it's an index fund. The fund size is $8.1 billion. The price of this particular fund by the net asset value is £83.03 per share. A lot cheaper than the first fund I mentioned. This fund tracks the FTSE All World Index and has 3,574 stocks in it. So a lot more in stocks within this particular fund because it has an all-world remit covering both the developed world and the emerging markets as well. And the total expense ratio for this fund is super cheap at 0.22%. Again, the minimums are quite low at £500 lump sum or £100 per month. And the performance has been pretty impressive. Only looking at the last 3 years, 15.99% in 2020, 26.57% in 2019, and negative 9.62% in 2018. Most funds experienced that dip in 2018 and saw a negative return. But do make sure you hang on in this video because there's one fund I'm going to mention later on that has not seen a loss at all since it was created in 2009. I'm going to be sharing that very shortly. Now, this particular fund we're talking about right now is made up of 100% equities, as we mentioned earlier, with an all-world focus. But notice the allocation to North America. it's much lower, 59.7%, with 57.2% of that being to the USA specifically. There's a 4.1% allocation to the UK and a total 17% allocation to Europe, and so on. You can also see up on the screen the total return of this fund by year, going as far back as 2012 when it first began. You can see there that this fund has done pretty well over these last few years, and the cumulative return of this fund since inception is 176.12% since it was launched in May 2012. In terms of portfolio makeup, as mentioned earlier, quite a decent allocation to North America, but by sector, if we're looking at the sectors specifically, you can see technology, again, remains quite a high allocation at 22.4%, followed by consumer discretionary at 15.7%, and then it carries on like that. In terms of detailed holdings, you can see up on the screen the usual suspects, your Apples, your Microsofts, your Amazons, and so on. But this time around, because this also has an exposure to emerging markets, you can see companies in the top 10, such as Tencent, for example. Okay, so taking things up a level, fund number 3 is the FTSE Global All Cap Index Fund Accumulation. Okay, so this particular fund takes things to a whole new level when it comes to giving you global exposure. Because not only is this fund giving you global exposure, but it's also giving you exposure to all caps. By all caps, I'm talking here exposure to large companies, to mid-sized companies, as well as to small companies. In addition to that, you are also getting exposure to the developed world and the emerging markets by investing in this particular fund. Now, here's a quick summary up on the screen of the key elements for you to watch out for before you invest in this fund. You can see there, it's an index fund. Obviously, the fund size is much smaller than the others. 940 million pounds is the size of this fund. The price is again much lower than the others at 164 pounds per share. This fund tracks the FTSE Global All Cap Index, okay, and has a large number of stocks within it, 6,893 stocks within this one fund alone. The total expense ratio is 0.23%, so just marginally more expensive than some of the others. And in terms of investing from a minimum perspective, again, it's the same as all the others, £500 minimum or £100 per month. And the performance has been pretty good. In 2020, an increase of 12.5% return. In 2019, 21.54%. And in 2018, a dip quite similar to all the other funds at minus 4.52%. Cumulative returns for this particular fund since it was launched in 2016 has been 65.51%, which says quite a lot. It's actually much lower than some of the others, although some of those other funds have been around for much longer than this particular fund. You get a dividend yield with this fund of 1.33% gross, and again, accumulating, which means it gets reinvested for you automatically. And in terms of the portfolio makeup here, you've got 100% equities, of course, with a larger allocation to North America at 60.51%, with the US dominating that at 57.8% allocation. You can also see quite a similar allocation to the previous fund, to Europe, 16.8%, with the UK making up 4.1% of that. And then it carries on like that with 10.7% allocation to emerging markets, and so on. This fund is really going above board to give you exposure to so many different parts of the world, such as China, Taiwan, Korea, Brazil, South Africa, and so on. And when you look at the weighting by sector, again, technology dominates here at 21.3% allocation to tech, consumer discretionary at 15.8%, and then it carries on with a much wider range of sectors in this particular fund. Here you're seeing things such as, basic materials, real estate. Again, within this fund, you're looking at, of course, financials, the healthcare sector, and so on. And the reason you've got a much wider sector allocation here is because you, of course, must have a much wider remit, because this fund is exposed to the developed world, to the emerging markets, as well as giving you exposure to large companies, mid-sized companies, and small companies as well. Again, if you dig a bit deeper into the underlying companies, you have the usual suspects dominating the top 10 list. But note, these are just top 10 within a much broader list of companies, 6,884 to be specific. Now, the final fund to mention is one that we actually invest in for our children within their accounts, and that's the Vanguard US Equity Index Fund Accumulation. Now, the other reason I mentioned this fund is that if you're somebody who watches US personal finance channels, you no doubt would have heard the acronyms VTSAX or VTI. The VTSAX is the Vanguard Total Stock Market Index Fund Admiral Shares. That's what the VTSAX actually represents. And the VTI is the Vanguard Total Stock Market Index Fund ETF. Now, the difference between them is that the VTI is the ETF equivalent of the VTSAX, which you might have heard about, as I mentioned, or maybe read in books and things like that. Now, I mention this because the UK equivalent of VTI is this particular fund, which is the Vanguard US Equity Index Fund Accumulation, which is fantastic because you can access the same funds that our US friends invest in the US, but you can do it here from the UK and do it quite fairly cheaply as well. This fund, though, is 100% US focused, okay? And it tracks the performance of the Standard & Poor's Total Market Index. What's super unique about that index is that this index is comprised of large, mid-sized, small, and micro companies, all of them based in the US. To be more specific, it's made up of 3,746 stocks. Now, this fund is super cheap. From a UK perspective, it's currently costing only 0.1%, and I believe it's even cheaper in the US. But from a UK perspective, 0.1% is amazing from a total expense ratio perspective. And it packs a punch from a performance perspective. That fee of 0.1%, this is the beauty of investing as cheaply as you can, does the job of amplifying the performance of this particular fund. I found it so fascinating when I researched this fund and dug a bit deeper to find that it has not had a single year of being loss-making since inception, which was in 2009. I'm just going to put up on the screen a screenshot for you to see what the performance of this fund has looked like over that time period. To invest in a fund like this, which has 100% US equity exposure, you would need to combine a fund like this with something else in order for you to build yourself a simple global portfolio. Although saying that, quite a lot of people simply back the US equities market so strongly because they believe in the power of the US market to continue to deliver time and time again. As you can see, the performance of this fund has shown us over the years. Here's a quick summary up on the screen, the key things for you to watch out for when it comes to this particular fund. This fund is an index fund, a UK OIC open-ended investment company. The fund size is £7.8 billion. And the price, though, this is a key bit, the price is £664.44 per share. So it's quite an expensive fund to invest into. The index being tracked is Total Market Index. And as I mentioned earlier, it's super cheap to invest in at 0.1%. From a returns perspective, in 2020, it returned 16.64%. In 2019, 25.42%. And in 2018, 0.22%. Cumulative returns since inception, though, for this fund in 2019, so this is net of fees and so on, is 577.53%, which is completely crazy when you think about it. I'm going to pop on the screen a chart for you to see what £10,000 invested back then would look like today. 10 grand from 2009 when this fund was launched would be sitting at £66,376 today, which is crazy when you think about it. Imagine if you extrapolated that, if you had £100,000 invested, you'd be sitting at almost 6 times that amount at over £600,000 today. In terms of portfolio makeup, as I mentioned earlier, this is 100% equities and 100% US. So you can see that it's 99.6% North America, with pretty much all of that being to the USA. From a sector perspective, there's a much larger allocation to tech companies. You can see that information technology allocation is 25.7%, with healthcare coming next at 13.3%, and then it carries on all the way to energy and utilities and so on. When you dive even deeper to look at the specific companies, here you start to see companies such as Berkshire Hathaway, Apple, Microsoft, Facebook, Amazon, Tesla, basically all the massive, kind of US giants that we're all used to. In summary, these 4 funds, if you invested in a selection of them, will make you richer over the next few years, provided you invest in them consistently every month and invest in them for the long term. They're suitable if you're somebody who has a higher risk tolerance and if your goal is to maximize your returns by having a much higher allocation to equities. These funds represent a good place to start for your journey towards financial independence, but I'd highly suggest making sure that you have an allocation to bonds and cash from a protection perspective, depending of course on where you are currently on that journey towards financial independence. Note that although I focused today exclusively on these 4 funds, which are equity only funds, it's worth mentioning that Vanguard has a whole list of many other funds, including the very popular live strategy funds, which are ready-made portfolios, equities and bonds. They're essentially fund of funds that are super diversified depending on what your risk tolerance is specifically. To learn more about the live strategy funds and many other Vanguard funds, we've created a video called The Complete Guide to Vanguard Funds. Check it out to the left. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and share this video with one other person who would love to know what funds they could explore for their journey towards financial independence. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What funds do you currently invest your money into on a monthly basis? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks again for watching today's video. And as ever, in all things, be thankful and seek joy. Take care and bye for now.